So today's talk is going to be on hospital chaplaincy from an atheist perspective. And so I want to warn you that I'm going to be talking about end-of-life issues. So the talk may bring up some big emotions. I encourage you to practice self-care both during the talk and tonight. I've also placed some Kleenex in the back of the room in case anyone needs it. So this talk came out of a request for a talk on hospital chaplaincy from an atheist perspective. What is hospital chaplaincy? Can atheists be chaplains? So first I'm going to answer those questions, and then I will give some advice for how to talk with grieving people. And then I will end the talk with 4 options for a funeral. So a funeral is a service that involves the body of the deceased as opposed to memorials where a body is usually not present. And I'll talk about 4 ways to have a funeral. And I'm just talking about basically what to do with the body. So another talk would be what to do with the actual service, the content of the service. A hospital chaplain works with any patient who is in the hospital or in hospice and their families. Usually it's a serious patient, but they will come anytime you like. The hospital staff is there to take care of the body of the patient, and the chaplain helps with the spiritual needs, which frees up the medical team from having to take care of the big emotional needs that sometimes people experience in hospitals. It's usually a really short visit. A chaplain will end by offering a prayer, and they need to hear an affirmative response from you. If you don't say no, but you don't say yes, you've said no. So it's affirmative consent. And you don't have to be religious to receive a visit from the chaplain. A chaplain on staff at a large metropolitan hospital might see 80 people a day from many different religious traditions. Examples are families may be practicing Sikhism, Buddhism, Islam, Roman Catholicism, atheism, just to name some. So the chaplain therefore cannot be the religion of all of their patients. Of course, a chaplain can be atheist, and probably labeling him or herself a humanist. The chaplain needs to know about the different religions and cultures. So for example, what do they teach about women and men and their social interactions, about blood transfusions, about organ transplants, and what are their typical funeral customs? For this talk, for parts of this talk, I lean for understanding on the writings of Pastor Patrick Vika, who is the director of chaplains at Parkview Health Hospital in Ohio. He says that a chaplain is not there to discuss theology. The job is to listen, and that's hard for lay people to do. His advice for chaplains would be good advice for any lay people too, so I hope we benefit from my sharing it. You don't need to defend God. When someone asks, why would God allow this to happen? Or, why won't God answer my prayers? We're not going to get into theology. And if someone is, and he also gives the advice, don't talk about heaven. Because even if you are working with somebody who is a believer and they believe strongly that they are going to heaven, they love this life, and it may just not be very comforting to tell them that they're going to go to heaven. So questions for people about meaning and about what happens after we die, those questions are best answered in church. And that's why here at Seattle Atheist Church, at least once a year, we have our talk on death and dying. But in the hospital setting, you are there to focus on the pathos. It's not about logos. It's okay to just deal with the emotions and sink into your heart, and that's the time to not necessarily be in your head. So here's some advice for lay people. Don't ask a lot of questions. What looks to you like showing interest may feel intrusive to a patient. Don't try to offer solutions. Assume that the patient and their medical team know a lot more about treating this illness than you do. Never suggest that a patient is responsible for causing their own illness. I've heard people suggest that somebody's cancer or heart disease is a result of their anger or resentment. Don't do that. Don't make it all about yourself by relating your own story or telling a hopeful story or saying that you know how the person feels. You don't know how the person feels. Just listen. And be comfortable with uncomfortable silence. When we were a smaller church and there were fewer people in the discussion circle, there was a lot more opportunity for just sitting in silence, awkward silence perhaps, waiting for somebody to have something to say. And that's a good practice. If you happen to say the wrong thing, forgive yourself and keep showing up, okay? You can apologize, but keep coming back. A chaplain tries to be available at the time of death. So one of the things that a chaplain does is to help someone, if they request it, think through what to do with the body of a loved one. So every culture has beautiful and sometimes elaborate rituals about what to do, and sometimes they begin with when the person is dying, right? Still in the process of dying. So if you have different traditions than the ones I share in my circle, what I share, please be invited to share them in the circle. My goal here is to advocate for the most environmentally and spiritually non-toxic form of disposing of mortal remains. It is not my intention to disparage anyone's faith tradition. So I'm going to talk about four practices, and they are burial, cremation, pyre, and recomposition. Sometimes, so let me begin, okay? So one of the things I want to acknowledge is that here in America, we're not very good at dealing with death. And we're even less good dealing with certain kinds of death. So the first one that I want to acknowledge is the death of a child. Either that has been born or unborn. So it is recommended that you use the name of the child when you are discussing plans with the family. Treat it like the loss of a family member, because it is. And I'm not going to get into details here, but I'm available to talk if anyone wants to talk to me about why certain things. But it is possible to have funerals if the family wishes for a child of 5 months in utero. And another option is a memorial service where you have a memorial box or an altar, and you might, for example, take a footprint of the child or do some other things to represent that child. I'm going to focus the rest of my talk on adults only. I wanted to acknowledge that because American women report feeling unsupported when they lose a child. And my guess is that men also feel that way, and they are so unsupported that they can't even talk about feeling unsupported. So prior to the Civil War, when people died, they were taken care of at home. They were cared for at home. It was usually the women who took care of the body for up to 3 days, and then they were buried at home or in a church, and it was usually the men who built a very simple pine box coffin for them. So, today people spend up to $10,000 on a funeral. How did this burial process become something which is so controlled, even the way we think about it is controlled by the funeral industry, the mortuary industry? So during the Civil War, we lost about 600,000 soldiers. And they died in battlefields often far away from home. And their families wanted to ship the bodies back for burial. But to travel by train, the bodies had to be embalmed and sealed in a metal casket. Also in 1869, Abraham Lincoln's body was embalmed and then shipped by train, and the train stopped at different places along the north, and his body was viewed by literally millions of people. The account of it is just incredible. And his body was viewed 29 days after his death. For 29 days, people came. So now we have made embalming and metal caskets a norm, but it has a huge environmental toll. A toll that our brains are not really built to understand. So, for example, we use 5.3 million gallons of embalming fluid, which is basically formaldehyde, every year. And when you hear that, you hear 5, which is small. 5 million. And the same thing for the wood, the metal, the concrete, and all the material, and all the land that goes into cemeteries. Like the whole thing is not environmentally sound. Okay, there is a tradition, there is an alternative to this tradition being since the Civil War, and that is to return to our real traditions, which is putting the unembalmed or natural body into a grave, preferably wrapped in a shroud and in an unlined grave. And there is a cemetery near here where we can do that. That's in Goldendale, Washington. Cremation is becoming more popular. For the first time, more of us will be cremated than buried. More Americans will be cremated than buried. And yet, bodies are still being embalmed for viewing, which is not good from an ecological point of view. Okay, the formaldehyde, also the mercury in people's teeth, all this getting into the air and into the water. But we don't have to use embalming fluid at all. It is possible to keep a body for 2, really 3, but the law in different places usually says 2 days using dry ice. And I took the time to learn how traditionally people did that. Now you might be thinking, from an atheist point of view, why would anyone want to sit with a dead body? Sitting with a dead body, or with the body, can be meaningful. It can help a person adjust to the idea that the loved one is gone and give them time to say goodbye privately in a way that feels more real than when the body is not in the room. And then the body can be cremated, and you can scatter the ashes at sea or in a state park with permission of the chief ranger. But we need to wrap our brain around the idea if you want to have the laying out of the body, that it doesn't have to be embalmed. You do have alternatives, but you have to be proactive in finding those. Let's talk about pyre. So a pyre is a funeral using open flames in the open air. And as I understand, it's pretty elaborate rituals around Hindu funerals that involve pyre. So it surprised me that although Hindus have a ritual around cremation, that in the United States there's only one pyre that's open to the public. There are 2. One is in a Buddhist monastery, it's closed to the public. The other is in the town of Keystone, Colorado, And it is closed to anyone who is not a member of that community, having lived there for a year before the death. The pyre struck me as being a lot more spiritually satisfying because you're in the open air and the community literally can encircle, the pyre. But there are still environmental concerns with this. They use a lot of wood, spew out a lot of ash, and in India, 50 to 60 million trees are burned during cremations every year, emitting about 8 million tons of carbon dioxide out into the environment. So what is my current thinking about the best way to say goodbye? Recomposing. So who here has heard of recomposing? Wow, I'm surprised at such a large number. Okay. So this is a concept that is still being developed, and luckily by a group led by a woman named Katrina Spade. You can watch her TED Talk, and she has a company called Recompose, which is based here in Seattle. So recomposing is composting human bodies. So if you really want your remains to be able to give back to the earth something sustaining, life-sustaining after you die, this is the way to go. So they don't actually really treat you completely like compost. There's certain things that we do in compost that they don't do. Won't say, but but each body has its own little mound. It's laid out on top of the ground. It's covered in organic materials such as leaves and grass, and then it is allowed to decompose. Right? There might be beetles and maggots and other things that help with that process, and they haven't completely mastered the process yet. So they're still doing actually research with bodies that have been donated to science. But we can turn bodies into soil. The molecules literally break down into atoms, and the atoms recompose into something else, into soil, which I think is great. And I also think it's great that she is also giving some thinking. The staff at Recompose includes people who focus on rituals and like what would the ritual space look like, what would the actual funeral look like, and all of that. So how cool is that? Let's discuss.